provided us with a gift to help fund this lecture series, but also had the idea of this lecture series before any of us here in the history department did, and proposed that we do something like this. An idea that met with instant enthusiasm amongst many colleagues. So it's with special thanks to him that we're looking forward to hearing from Cy Mauskopf. We'll inaugurate this series this afternoon with a talk on his topic of choice. And you know, one of the reasons I needed that written introduction is so I could go through the list of his accomplishments and awards in a long career. He himself called it a long career, so I'm committed to do so. And now I can't, but I can remember a couple of fellowships from the Chemical Heritage Foundation, grants from National Science Foundation, an award for distinguished accomplishment in the history of chemistry from the American Chemical Society, a teaching award, a distinguished alumni teaching award for undergraduate teaching at Duke. Certainly very merited by years of service to the history department, one of the pioneers of the focus program here at Duke, which has been so successful in the last decade or so. I also want to say that over the years I have enjoyed numerous conversations with Cy myself. I remember when I first came here, about 1762 or wherever it was, and he was already here. I papered the walls of my office with pictures of Chartres Cathedral. Oh, it was Reims and Chartres. Reims and Chartres. And this was for me a way of giving it a homey look. And, but it also gave rise to a whole number of conversations between Cy and me on the history of Gothic architecture and the relative splendors of different sites. And that in particular did a lot to make me feel at home in a new place in a way that pictures alone couldn't do. Later we had many other conversations about the history of science, parapsychology, about the chemical revolution, phlogiston. All I know about phlogiston is owed to Cy. And always there's been a kind of intellectual zest that I enjoy in having these conversations with Cy, as if I've just entered into, you know, a kind of enjoyable, casual salon where a kind of ongoing discussion is occurring and can range over almost any topic whatsoever, and always with the plenty of time to pause for a good joke that happens to mind. And I know that Cy's own work, numerous books and anthologies, I counted over a dozen articles in recent years on the history of gunpowder, which you'll be happy to know I'm not going to call an explosive topic. But I can assure you that Cy has cleared a lot of smoke away from certain issues involving this topic. But one of the things that's characteristic of Cy's intellectual mission has always been linking between theory and specific episodes of the history of science that he has studied. And he's always been, it seems to me in any way, on top of the wide-ranging debates in the history of science that are going on in the last few decades. And for that reason, I'm particularly keen to hear his talk today, which is Bridging the Two Cultures or Not, Reflections on a Long Career in History of Science
Bill, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm delighted to see you all here. I'm delighted to be here. Other than saying phlogiston doesn't exist, so I don't know what you learned, and to say that I've moved on to smokeless coffee now, so I don't know that will be clearing any more smoke away. I'll plunge right into my talk. On his deathbed, the Roman Emperor Vespasian supposedly uttered this witticism: "Vai, puto Deus fio." Dear me, I think I am becoming a god. I'm not on my deathbed yet, and it's not my style to be quite so pretentious, even in wit. But I will note that we are here to celebrate and put to rest my career of almost half a century as a teacher and researcher in the history of science at Duke University. I am honored and abashed to be asked to deliver an address to mark my own retirement. But I have been in something of an elegiac and synthesizing research mood recently. My friend and former colleague, Alex Rowland, recently retired, and I have jointly written a narrative on the historiographical developments in the history of science and technology. And my friend and colleague, also former, now at the University of Michigan, Tad Schmaltz, and I are editing a book on integrating the history and philosophy of science, which has also compelled me to a self-examination about my own career and its relation to more general developments in the history of science. I thought I would use these minutes to reflect on something quite personal: how I assess my local career as an historian of science at Duke. Such a reflection will necessarily involve broader considerations about general changes, about changes at Duke, about the transformation of the historical discipline, and of course about how my own discipline of the history of science radically changed during my long career here. Indeed, my main challenge today will be to rein myself in so that I don't end up hours from now lecturing at the walls, as Newton is supposed to have done. I mean, good company, of course. I have chosen as a general theme to organize my thoughts around the famous or notorious two cultures of C.P. Snow's Reed lecture, The Two Cultures and the Scientific Revolution, delivered at Cambridge University on May 7th, 1959, and published the same year. Snow's lecture had two principal themes. They are, one, the polarization and separation of the culture of the scientists from that of the literary intellectuals, and two, the social, political, and moral superiority of the culture of the scientists over that of the literary intellectuals. In Snow's phrase, the former, that is, the scientists, naturally have the future in their bones, whereas literary intellectuals are natural Luddites. Let's give it a page. Over the years, Snow has been dismissed, reviled, and ridiculed over this lecture. Most famously in 1962 by the literary scholar F.R. Leavis in another Cambridge lecture, Two Cultures, ? The significance of C.P. Snow. Yet somehow the two cultures as a mantra and subject for continual debate refuses to die. In recent years, the issues of two cultures has resurfaced at Duke. On September 12th, 2005, the Duke chapter of Phi Beta Kappa, of which I was then president, sponsored an unusual and I dare say innovative discussion on converging and diverging the sciences and the humanities, involving undergraduates, graduate students, faculty, as well as President Broadhead and the Duke Medical Chancellor Victor Zhao. Very recently, on November 17th, 2010, Dr. Rudy M. Baum, editor-in-chief of the important weekly scientific journal Chemical and Engineering News, gave a presentation at the IDC class of the focus program Faces of Science, in which I've been teaching, on his recent article, Science and the Nature of All. The article began, quote, "At the dawn of the 21st century, C.P. Snow's two cultures are alive and well. The chasm between the two cultures, between science and the humanities, or perhaps more accurately, between scientific and non-scientific ways of knowing the world, is as deep as it was 4 decades ago." This was written at the beginning of the 20th century, when Snow first articulated his powerful metaphor. As an addendum, I might also note the current crisis in the humanities in this country and abroad, particularly in Great Britain. Stanley Fish encapsulated the difference between the humanities and the sciences generally as being symbolized by access to extra-university funding. Referring to the case that has recently sparked debate about this crisis, the announcement on October 1st by the president of the State University of New York at Albany that the language and theater arts departments were being eliminated, Fish wrote, I quote, "Because the humanities cannot count on heavy infusions of federal research dollars as the sciences can, anywhere from $100 million to $1 billion each year, there is a shortfall the humanities have no way of making up. A chemistry professor whose salary is only partly financed by the state can go out and get federal dollars to pay the rest and more. A humanities professor can't." Now that's background. Now I'm going to turn to me. I began graduate study in the history of science in 1960, so it's 50 years now since I joined the field. The year after Snow's Reed lecture. My entrance into the field was rather serendipitous and reflected a sequential interest in the sciences and the humanities. As an undergraduate at Cornell, I had been a pre-med chemistry major for 3 years. But in my first semester, I had become enthralled by a history course in Western civilization, particularly the section on medieval history. I switched from chemistry to history and wrote an honors thesis on medieval canon law. I had, in fact, applied to graduate school to study medieval history. However, when I got to Princeton, I was informed by the director of graduate studies that I had been placed in a new program in history and philosophy of science because of my heavy concentration of undergraduate pre-med science courses. They clearly needed more bodies. I was, of course, given the choice of following my original intention and not joining the program, but I decided to do both, and I was able to do both, that is, study medieval history and specialize in the history of science. And my research focus at disciplinary identity since then has laid in the history of science, indeed in the history of comparatively modern science, 18th and 19th century. And I began my career at Duke in 1964 in the history department as an historian of science. I cannot remember paying much attention to the two-culture controversy during my years in graduate school, but when I arrived here, several people told me that an attraction of the history of science lay in its potential to bridge the sciences and the humanities. I was taken with this potential for the history of science, 3 pages, and eventually made it something of my mission, but not at the start of my new career. More on the mission later. From the start, my disciplinary home at Duke has been in the history department. In the early 1960s, I believe, history of science seemed particularly suitable for history departments. Here's the rest of my photos class. They're not late as history of science seemed particularly suitable for history departments because of their traditional foci, namely Eurocentric, with American history, of course, male-oriented, and largely elitist. Dead, rich, white males. The history of science was also Eurocentric in orientation and also studied largely dead, rich, white males. Until well into the 20th century, there were few women scientists and even fewer minority scientists, with the exception of scientists of Jewish ethnicity. Until the 19th century, scientists rarely came from deprived backgrounds. The perspective of history of science in the early 1960s hewed close to that of traditional European intellectual history. In addition to the characteristics of scientists just mentioned, the field largely focused on the development of scientific ideas, with relatively little concern for causal relations of extraneous social, cultural, or political factors to scientific developments. During the 1960s and 1970s, major shifts took place in the discipline of history and in the contemporary social and cultural fabric, both to change the relationship of the history of science to the historical profession and to transform the history of science itself. First, history. The most notable feature was the vast broadening of the discipline's purview, from Eurocentric to world, from elites to workers, slaves, and colonials, from almost exclusively male to gender and also resulted in something of a marginalization of the history of science within history, for the reasons stated above. I might say the same thing happened to a degree to European intellectual history. More broadly, the same decades witnessed the first comprehensive critique of the scientific enterprise in modern times, despite, or perhaps because, of the unprecedented growth of government-funded big science, capped by the first manned moon landing on July 20th, 1969. Representative of the growing critique of science was Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in September 1962. The title referred to the deathly future scenario when the chemical herbicides and pesticides used to advance agricultural production will, in fact, result in a dead world, bereft of birds and insects to signal the advent of the season of new life. This was quite a change from the optimism of DuPont's 1935 slogan, "Better things for better living through chemistry." Carson's book really signaled a new era of concern and critique, exemplified by the counterculture interest in alternative or new age science, the rise of the environmental movements during the 1970s, the Vietnam War with its use of chemical defoliants, Agent Orange, exacerbated the critical mood, and to many who witnessed the 1969 moon landing, the domestic and international social turmoil and change, civil rights and colonial independence movements seemed to be far more significant. The dominant perspective in the history of science also underwent radical transformation in the 1960s and 1970s. Previously, it had been not only idealist, as mentioned, but also what I would call progressivist. By this I mean that, however empathetic an historian of science became with her period of study, it was accepted as largely unproblematic that science inexorably progressed in explanatory range and precision, and in its method of discovery of knowledge of an independently existing natural world. The progressivist perspective was challenged most dramatically by Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions of 1962, the same year, interestingly, that Rachel Carson published. Kuhn replaced the progressivist model of scientific development by a much more disjointed one. Mature scientific development, what Kuhn called normal science, was punctuated by episodes of scientific revolutions, in which one set of guiding principles for scientific research, paradigms, or disciplinary matrices, was rejected by a significant part of a disciplinary scientific community and replaced by another set incommensurable with its predecessors. The role that Kuhn assigned to scientific communities implied that social factors were involved in scientific change, particularly in revolutionary episodes. Moreover, at the end of the book, Kuhn briefly and rather cryptically questioned the very notion of scientific progress. Both of these were developed in the 1970s by the new Sociology of Scientific Knowledge, the so-called SSK program, developed first in Great Britain. The establishment of scientific practices and change thereof was explained in terms of the social environment and the interests of the individual actors, or more broadly, the structure of the relevant scientific community. Power, authority, and resources exerted a preponderant influence in determining whether crisis and revolution were at hand and what resulting scientific practices would ensue. Most radical was the upending of the idealist historical vision. Scientific knowledge itself was socially constructed, and the issue of how such knowledge related to an independently existing natural world became either highly problematic or was ignored. In highlighting the social and cultural context of scientific knowledge production, note not discovery anymore, and change, this new perspective dovetailed well with other developments taking place within and without the history profession, such as feminism. A feminist or oriented history of science had come into existence by the 1980s. Scientific practice itself, the means by which scientific knowledge was produced, came under analysis and investigation as a species of anthropology. And the scientists whom Snow, in good Enlightenment fashion, had seen as the most socially progressive of people, again I quote from the two cultures, they are freer than most people from racial feelings. In their own internal climate, the breeze of the equality of man hits you In the face of that, scientists now were unmasked as being as susceptible to prejudice as anyone else, and moreover, able to inscribe that prejudice onto the natural world as scientific knowledge. Snow himself had originally envisaged the history of science as a resource to validate his vision of scientific progress. By the 1980s, the new dominant perspective of the field had been transformed virtually into the antithesis of progressivism. My own career, I'm not saying this, by the way, to necessarily criticize the changes, but just to describe them. My own career followed a more placid path during these years and was centered largely in the Department of History. The most notable event, perhaps, was the inception in 1967 of what became a 40-year-long tradition. I'm sorry he can't be here, namely Michael McFaul today. He's apologized. Tradition of a Duke UNC spring seminar taught by Michael McFaul, my UNC colleague and fellow alumnus from the Princeton History, Philosophy, and Science program, and me. Many of my departmental colleagues were bemused by the idea of a joint UNC-Duke seminar because in the 1960s there was very little in the way of cooperative academic activities between the two universities despite their proximity. Deciding to start at the highest level, we devoted our first seminar to Newton. This proved to be fortuitous, for our first and probably greatest graduate student, alas, the late Betty Jo Dobbs, took the seminar, wrote a research paper on the few chemical publications of Sir Isaac, and then transmuted the paper into a pioneering dissertation on Newton's decades-long alchemical investigation. The resulting book, The Foundation of Newton's Alchemy, or The Hunting of the Green Lion, added a new and very unexpected dimension to the scientists whose work in mathematics and physics is universally regarded as the crown of the scientific revolution. And it has spawned a comprehensive reevaluation of the nature and the role of alchemy in early modern science. Stay tuned, I'm co-editing a book that will deal with chemistry, as we call it now, which means chemistry and alchemy in the early modern period. Moreover, her study of 17th century alchemy directly inspired Michael and me to take up the study of the history of a much more contemporary and local marginal science, parapsychology. Researched and written in the 1970s, this book was published in 1980 as The Elusive Science, Origins of Experimental Psychical Research. It's fair to say that our book did not impact on the general field of the history of science the way Betty Jo's work on alchemy did, but it was an expression of the broader and more flexible perspective that was developing in the field. Let me take a breath. You with me? It was in the late 1970s that I began actively to attempt to fill my disciplinary mission as an historian of science to bridge the academic cultures, which have become much more complex and expanded in purview since the original controversy over two cultures. The opportunity was provided by what was viewed as a crisis in the important segments of undergraduate education, particularly in the sciences, namely the rise of pre-professionalism. If memory serves, the cause, or a good part of it, was the downsizing of federal government support for science in the 1970s, including support for graduate training. Consequently, science-oriented undergraduates turned to careers in science-related professions, particularly medicine. There was growing concern that these undergraduates were coming to focus too narrowly on what it would take to achieve their professional goal, and not on getting a broad liberal arts education. Receiving considerable largesse from the Commonwealth Fund to address this problem, Duke established a steering committee of faculty who were charged to develop strategies to address what were seen as components of the problem. I presided over a committee dealing with just about everything. I think it was called Science, Technology, and Society, or some such title. It was a truly blue ribbon committee. For example, the professor of psychiatry, H.H. Brody, future president of Duke University, was a member. I had a vision for an undergraduate program that would span not only Trinity College, but also the science-oriented professional schools, particularly engineering of William Bevan, chair of the psychology department and provost at Duke from 1979 to 1983. Bill Bevan was a remarkable person. Trained in psychology at Duke, he had become provost at Johns Hopkins, and then in 1970 took the post of executive officer of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, before returning to Duke in 1974. Once at Duke, Bevan deployed his wide range of professional interests in program building. Probably the most famous program was related to his psychological professionalism, the TIP, or Talent Identification Program, which had begun at Johns Hopkins and was imported to Duke and still flourishes. But he also brought this perspective of AAAS executive by founding the Roundtable on Science and Public Affairs program with the then Dean of the Graduate School, John McKinney. The core of this program was a lecture series by distinguished persons in science, medicine, technology, and policy, Nobel laureates, surgeons, generals, presidential science advisors, and the like. For several years, there was also a sequel discussion over lunch the day following the lecture for about 40 invited guests from the universities and research corporations in Research Triangle Park. I dare say there has been nothing quite like these luncheons since their demise, and this is really a shame. An organization with which I'm associated, and Bill has mentioned it, the Chemical Heritage Foundation, is currently trying to revive something like this in RTP. There was also a postdoctoral component and a seminar on policy issues in science, technology, and medicine, taught jointly by Bevan and McKinney. It was through participation in this program, and more particularly, recognition that many of my best history of science undergraduates were enrolled in the Bevan-McKinney seminar and were bringing perspectives gained there to my classes that formed my vision. The result of the vision and the committee deliberation was the program in Science, Society, and Human Values. Shortly afterwards, the title was changed to Science, Technology, and Human Values, or STHV. Startup funds came from the Commonwealth Fund grant to Duke, but facilitated by the Duke administration, particularly Bill Bevan, now provost, we received a large grant from the Pew Foundation. I think we might have been the first certificate program, but I'm not sure. In the special collections, they weren't able to get the information to me in time for this talk. We established a structure whereby student participants had to take 5 courses, which fell into a 3x3 matrix. If you imagine, let's say at the top, science, technology, and medicine, and on the side, ethics, analysis, by which we meant history of, philosophy of, sociology of, science, medicine, technology, and finally, policy. So sample courses might be medical ethics, history of technology, and science policy. And I think you can see how they fall on that 3x3 matrix. These were for the most part courses already in existence. In addition, a year-long pair of interdisciplinary senior seminars, team taught by scientists and humanists or social scientists, had to be completed. We had a steering committee consisting of scientists, engineers, historians, social scientists, and humanists, and a student committee. One of the early students representatives was the now distinguished medical ethicist Jeremy Sugarman, who's at Johns Hopkins University now. And Jeremy has reminded me several times of how I used to literally wake him up at 8 or 9 in the morning to attend student committee meetings. The faculty committee met mostly in the laboratory of Dick White, who is present here, over sherry provided by him. In order to prepare for this address, I have been rummaging in special collections, and for the first time in my life, doing historical investigations on myself. It's an interesting, I'm not sure I recommend it. Quite funny thing. I came upon this statement of the purpose and plan set out to prospective students over my signature and dated February 12, 1982. And I'm going to beg your patience while I read some of the justification for the STHV program and some description of it. It's a tract from the early 80s, but alas, it's still a tract for today, because many of the issues and challenges have not been addressed any better in the ensuing 30 years. Here we go. There is no denying that science and technology have strongly influenced our social development. The question of promoting energy generation from nuclear versus versus renewable resources, computer data banks versus individual privacy, automobiles versus mass transportation are high on the immediate public agenda of many industrial nations. It is only in recent years that the complexity of such questions has called for a need to develop new modes of inquiry and demands new perspectives in science education. The STHV program was established at Duke to help in meeting these needs. The program brings together health professionals, humanists, social scientists, engineers, and natural scientists who combine their perspectives and work beyond boundaries of their individual disciplines in teaching and research. It encourages interdisciplinary teamwork and assists in gaining new insights in approaching complex socio-technical problems. Currently, there are over 50 students enrolled in the STHV program. These students have majors in engineering, French, psychology, botany, zoology, chemistry, and religion. That's the end of the recruitment. I might say there was an attached list of the students. In fact, there were over 65 of them. So I was surprised at how well we had done. I came across material relating to the senior seminars, and some of the people present will recognize this. For the academic year 1981-1982, there were two. In the fall, there was one on nuclear resources in North Carolina, jointly taught, and this again I totally forgot this, taught by Jeff Pierce of Civil and Environmental Engineering and Roy Weintraub of the Economics Department. The following spring, in spring of 1982, there was a senior seminar on evolution, team taught by Dick White, who is here, and Robert Brandon. So Dick White in botany and Robert Brandon in philosophy. I also noted that STHV sponsored a wine and cheese open house. Students could still be served wine. On November 3rd, 1983, with Earl Dowell, Dean of the School of Engineering, leading a discussion on technology in a liberal arts education. In initiating and developing this program, I soon realized that Duke possessed an important faculty culture that had two characteristics quite rare in major research universities, at least in my experience. The first is what I would call disciplinary permeability. This is not quite the same thing as interdisciplinarity. It's a word, that's a word by the way I can barely say. It's a good job. For it did not necessarily lead to faculty in different disciplines working together on a specific research project, or even necessarily teaching together, although it could lead to either or both. Rather, it was something looser, perhaps something akin to what transpires or used to among the faculty of liberal arts colleges. It consists in the ability of colleagues across disciplines to talk together and maybe work together programmatically. The second characteristic no doubt promotes the first, and it is this: a deep commitment on the part of Duke faculty, even in the professional schools, to serious undergraduate teaching. Even as Duke ascended into the ranks of a first-rate research university, this commitment has persisted and contributes to the peculiar and, in my view, outstanding academic culture that characterizes Duke. I directed the STHV program until 1984 when my colleague Alex Rowland assumed the directorship for another 4 years. Towards the end of my tenure as director, Bevan left Duke for the MacArthur Foundation, and STHV took over the running of the Roundtable program, which lasted, I think, till around 1990. The STHV program itself continued to operate, eventually from the Pratt School of Engineering, for another decade or so, to be followed by the current ISIS program. Much of my university activities since 1980 have been devoted to facilitating similar inter- or better cross-disciplinary activities. Sometime in the early 1980s, Bill Bevan asked me to facilitate interdisciplinary faculty seminars. These reflect, I think, Bevan's commitment to what I've just termed disciplinary permeability. The first and longest lasting arose out of my own changing perspectives of an historian of science and was initially named The Progress of Knowledge, but significantly the title morphed into The Problems of Knowledge later on. This and the other seminars had about a dozen participants who met over lunch and discussed either a research paper of one of the participants or some reading of common interest. At their peak, we had at least 5 seminars, faculty seminars, running concurrently. The ones I remember, in addition to the knowledge seminar, were devoted to Darwinism and to Marxism. This latter morphed into which, if my Googling is correct, still exists in the program in literature. I have one general rule for these seminars. I think it's a useful administrative rule. It's this: don't beat a dead horse into the ground. If the participants think that they have done enough with their seminar, either drop it or move on to another topic. And this was, I think, pretty successful. I have dwelt on Bill Levin quite a bit because I think he brought an extraordinary vision of collegiate interaction to Duke that, in my opinion, receded somewhat since he left, although the Franklin Center goes a long way to ameliorate this. And I moved on to other things in the later 1980s. I became director of graduate studies in the history department and then went on sabbatical leave to the Beckman Center for the History of Chemistry in Philadelphia and the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in 1989. When I came back from my sabbatical, I resumed my role as a facilitator of interdisciplinary activities, first as the faculty advisor to the Society of Duke Fellows. This was a society of the graduate students with named fellowships across the entire spectrum of the university. Matt Cardinal, a physical anthropologist, was the original faculty advisor, but he decided to step down and recommended me instead, and I served in this function for about 3 years. Working with an enthusiastic steering committee of graduate students, we organized cross-disciplinary evening discussions led by faculty, again with some wine and cheese. And part of my, I might say, moral lesson is the importance of wine. Plato recognized that, and I think, as in many things, we can take a leaf from Plato here. One memorable meeting I remember was over the very controversial book, The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life. And it was led by, the book is by Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray. The discussion was led by the distinguished Duke psychologist John Statton and the brilliant young historian of medicine, Keith Whaley, then at UNC Chapel Hill. I gave up my mentorship of the Society of Duke Fellows in 1995 to direct my penultimate, in some ways most ambitious, interdisciplinary enterprise, the Focus Interdisciplinary Program. I was soon joined by an amazing assistant director, Barbara Babs-Wise. Babs and I, she really served as my co-director, supervised Focus for 8 years, until 2003. I think we were very effective, and indeed many have given us too much credit, saying that we sort of founded Focus. I would like to set the record straight here. Focus was the brainchild of a committee headed by Angela O'Ran, now Dean of the Social Sciences, around 1990. And it was run very effectively, and I should say with an absolute minimum of resources by Professor Thomas McCullough of the Department of Religion until 1995. We built on very solid foundations of Angela's vision and Tom's implementation of this vision. One aspect of Focus did relate directly to my teaching in the history of science, and this was the organization of some new Focus programs. In 1979, I opened a course in the history of science in the 20th century, probably the most conceptually challenging course I ever instituted for me as well as for the students. And I might say the course aborted halfway through, but literally I had to go in for brain surgery. That's another lecture. One feature of the course was a final essay in which the students took up a contemporary scientific issue that was A, significant, B, controversial, and C, still unresolved and open-ended. The idea was to give the students a sense of science as not a closed activity, historically, but ongoing. Two topics that particularly attracted student interest were the environmental controversies and the manifold issues in the neurosciences. Just a year before I became director of Focus, I proposed to Dick White, then Dean of Trinity College, the implementation of pilot team-taught interdisciplinary seminars, science around these topics, and they did run for a year or two. However, once in Focus, I developed a more ambitious idea, 2 Focus programs around these topics. Their implementation and supervising Focus in general brought home to me as intensely as anything in my long-term career how alive and well those 2 components of Duke faculty culture that I previously mentioned, namely, how alive and well they were, namely disciplinary permeability and a deep commitment to serious undergraduate teaching. Schmaltz, formerly professor of philosophy and for a year or two chair of the philosophy department at Duke. Tad approached me about 5 years ago about forming an entity involving history and philosophy of science. The result is the above-mentioned program. It has sponsored yearly core seminars, and I've taught him 2 of them. Again, one of my co-teachers is here, Alex Rosenberg. And that was a real trip that summer. Which have almost always been oversubscribed, and we held a conference 3 years ago, too, which I'm delighted to say is to be published, I think I've mentioned this already, as Integrating the History and Philosophy of Science as a volume in the Boston Studies in Philosophy of Science series. In order for this promising program to continue and expand, it will obviously be necessary that there be a continued presence of the history of science at Duke. I would like to say that over my many years at Duke, I have been proud to have attracted some extraordinarily bright science majors to do a history minor with a concentration in the history of science, technology, and medicine. About a dozen of these students have subsequently gone on to do graduate work in the history of science and related fields. One of them was here, sitting with your English, right up there. I should mention 2 of the earliest are colleagues in the history department, Peter English and Jeff Baker in the history of medicine. I should also include Tom Robichaud in this list. Although Tom did not go on directly into the history of science, he did study with me as an undergraduate, and he teaches what is perhaps the most popular history of science course ever at Duke, Magic, Science, and Religion. At least one of these students will be returning for my retirement celebration this Saturday. At this point, I would also like to mention the extraordinary personal and professional relationship I've had with my colleague Alex Rowe. Since he came to Duke in 1980, we have frequently team-taught a course on the changing historical relation between science and technology, and we have recently published together. I think that our efforts, as well as those of our colleagues in the history of medicine, have enhanced the attraction of the history curriculum to undergraduates in the sciences and engineering. Now, I'm coming to the coda, to use a musical expression. How does all that I have been narrating relate to my initial theme, the 2 cultures controversy? Let me conclude by sketching out some tentative and I dare say chaotic thoughts. So I beg your indulgence. They don't quite add up. Firstly, I think C.P. Snow did put his finger on an issue that has been persistent since his time. Moreover, although it may have arisen from local conditions in post-World War II Britain, as a recent book by Guy Ortolato called The 2-Culture Controversy, Science, Literature, and Cultural Politics in Post-War Britain suggests, it has become much more universal in its implications and applications. This is especially true as science and science-based technologies have become far more complex and socially and environmentally interactive in the 50 years since Snow's lecture. Are other domains of knowledge, particularly the humanities, destined to wither as a recent crisis may portend, in the face of the fact that science and science-based technologies have become more than ever the governing world economic engines? Might they contribute, that is, these other domains, the humanities, to the elucidation of the challenges facing us regarding science and industry? One area that has obviously concerned me in this respect for a very long time is academic pedagogy. Despite the